Good evening. Sir Geoffrey Howe, Mrs Thatcher's longest-serving colleague throughout her years in power, turned on her in the Commons today and accused her of risking the nation's future. He was explaining for the first time why he resigned as Deputy Prime Minister 12 days ago. Most MPs had expected a coded diplomatic speech. Instead, years of resentment and frustration were compressed into a bitter attack on Mrs Thatcher and her attitude to Europe. He called on Conservative MPs to consider what he described as their conflict of loyalties and made a challenge for the leadership of the party almost inevitable. Tonight, the Labour leader, Neil Kinnock, called for an immediate general election.
The Prime Minister left for the House knowing that Sir Geoffrey Howe, the last survivor of her 1979 government, had the chance to make or break her prospects of frightening off or at least demolishing the challenge to her leadership. Sir Geoffrey, silent in the 12 days since his resignation, had taken a lonely decision to tell all that was in his heart about Margaret Thatcher's method of running her cabinet. In the Commons, he scoffed at ministers who say he resigned over Mrs Thatcher's style.
Indeed, if some of my former colleagues are to be believed, I must be the first minister in history who resigned because he was in full agreement with government policy.
Instead, he regarded it as a tragedy that Britain had not entered the exchange rate mechanism 5 years earlier, and that only a threat of resignation by him and Nigel Lawson had persuaded her to accept the Madrid conditions for entry. Then he made even John Major look thoughtful.
Our successor as Chancellor of the Exchequer has, during the last year, had to devote a good deal of his considerable talent to demonstrating exactly how those Madrid conditions have been attained. It is now, alas, impossible to resist the conclusion that today's higher rates of inflation could well have been avoided had the question of ERM membership been properly considered and resolved at a much earlier stage.
He regretted Mrs Thatcher's statement that Britain had surrendered enough to Europe and ridiculed her fears.
And the nightmare image sometimes conjured up by my right honourable friend, who seems sometimes to look out upon a continent that is positively teeming with ill-intentioned people, scheming, in her words, to extinguish democracy, to dissolve our national identities, to lead us through the back door into a federal Europe. What kind of vision is that, Mr. Speaker, for our business people who trade there each day, for our financiers who seek to make London the money capital of Europe, or for all the young people of today?
He also regarded as tragic her dismissal of the thought that John Major's proposal for a parallel currency, the hard écu, might catch on in Europe, and her belief that this was a matter for future generations.
Those future generations are with us today. How on earth are the Chancellor and the Governor of the Bank of England, commending the hard écu as they strive to do, to be taken as serious participants in the debate against that kind of background noise?
He picked up the Prime Minister's own cricketing metaphor.
It's rather like sending your opening batsmen to the crease, only for them to find, the moment the first balls are bowled, that their bats have been broken before the game by the team captain.
He declared solemnly that her perceived attitude towards Europe was running risks with Britain's future. He reasserted his own commitment to government by persuasion.
But I realise now that the task has become futile, of trying to stretch the meaning of words beyond what was credible, of trying to pretend there was a common policy when every step forward risked being subverted by some casual comment or impulsive answer.
He saw conflict between loyalty to her and to the interest of the nation.
I no longer believe it possible to resolve that conflict from within this government. That is why I have resigned. In doing so, I have done what I believe to be right for my party and my country. The time has come for others to consider their own response to the tragic conflict of loyalties with which I have myself wrestled for perhaps too long.
This uncharacteristically savage speech from a man whose mildness allowed Dennis Healey to describe him as a half-dead sheep transforms the leadership election. Mrs Thatcher's Conservative critics were saying in the lobbies later that she was already dead in the water, or that the game was up. Her supporters thought this was gross overreaction. Those who spoke on the record agreed at least on the serious impact of the speech.
It strengthens, I think, the feelings of all those who insist that there simply must be a change and that we cannot go on like this. That is what is strengthened, and therefore there will be immense pressure, and don't ask me exactly how it's going to work out, but immense pressure for there to be a change, a turning over of a new leaf of the leadership of this party compared with what has been going on in recent days, which cannot continue.
I think the Tory party is in fair-sized turmoil at the moment, but I expect that at the end of the day the Prime Minister will win, and I hope she won't be wounded too much when she wins.
He was telling the House that the economic ills that the country has suffered since were the Prime Minister's responsibility, as he sees it. That must mean that a leadership contest will take place next week, and that must mean that there will be a contest between the Prime Minister and Michael Heseltine. And what the Conservative Party has to do is get that contest out of the way, make its decision, and then rally behind the leader of the Conservative Party.
Some of us who are at the forefront and constitute the majority for the government at the moment don't feel that speeches like that are calculated to be helpful. The fact is that he has the power to wound and not to be constructive, and I'm disappointed that he didn't stay in the cabinet to argue his corner there.
Michael Heseltine understandably found this an impressive speech, for it strengthens his case against the Prime Minister, and he seems certain to announce his candidature tomorrow. His friends say he can only force the Prime Minister into a second ballot in the election if those contemplating abstaining actually vote for him. This challenge looks much more serious tonight. At least one member of the Cabinet is said now to believe that Mrs. Thatcher could lose. That still seems improbable, for the instinct of loyalty to a Prime Minister is strong. But if the contest does go to a second ballot, it's now possible that Sir Geoffrey and even members of the Cabinet might be drawn in.